Thank you so much. Thanks for that lovely introduction, and thank you for putting on this amazing event, Julie and Remy. As Remy said, I'm Helen, and I wanted to talk today about a subject that's very close to my heart as a woman in tech, and that is diversity in the tech industry, and more specifically in engineering. And I have to admit, when I first got into engineering, I was kind of aware there was a diversity problem vaguely, but I wasn't aware of the extent of it or why it was actually a problem in the first place. And as I started to look into it a little bit more, I was quite surprised people weren't talking about it more, because I found the statistics quite shocking. And particularly given that if you go back to the early days of the tech industry, we have a lot of examples of people from minority groups who really made a massive contribution. So I wanted to talk a bit about that. And also, I wanted to talk about some of the real world reasons why it benefits us to have diverse teams when we're building and designing our products. So I think someone on the board said something about waiting for cat pictures, so I delivered. So a little bit about me and my background. I currently work as a software engineer for a company called MPB. I am very local to FFConf. I live in Brighton with my husband, my 11-year-old stepson, and my 2 cats, Sam and Spike. This one's Spike, and he was simply too cute to not share. My path into software engineering was less than conventional, and this can often be true for women and people from other minority groups. I did my GCSEs in the 90s, and while I did have enough of an interest in computing to elect to do an information systems GCSE, of the 25 or so people in that group, I was one of 2 girls. And added to that, there were some issues about how and what we were being taught, because my school was very underfunded. And as a result, the majority of the people in that class got pretty poor grades, myself included. As I was getting A's and B's and everything else, I kind of thought, well, maybe, sadly, computing just isn't for me, particularly as I wasn't feeling very comfortable or confident in that room, given the gender disparity. So I went on to do a degree in theatre, and after graduating, I took up various admin roles while I waited for my big break into Hollywood. By 2017, I had accidentally worked my way up to be an executive assistant in my day job, but Hollywood had yet to return my calls. I began to think I needed an alternative career, because I got as far as I was ever going to get in admin without going into management, which I didn't really want to do. So I decided to look at coding again. Now, thankfully, things had moved on so much since the 90s. I was now able to access pretty much any course I wanted to online, and I was working with some truly wonderful developers in the company where I was at the time, who gave me pointers on where to get started and told me about a charity with a local chapter called Codebar. Yes, some of them are here today. So Codebar, for anyone who hasn't heard of it, helps people from underrepresented groups learn to code by providing free workshops. I started attending as a student, and by a weird coincidence, my first ever coach at Codebar is the second speaker today, Chetan. So after a while, they said they needed an organizer, so I volunteered, and then I helped to run the Brighton Codebar chapter for a few years. In terms of my personal learning journey, it took about a year of me dedicating everything I had to teaching myself front-end development. But then the company where I was able to offer me a job in the engineering team as a junior. And the rest is history. So why am I telling you all of this? Well, the reason is that, as I said earlier, we have this huge diversity problem in the tech industry, and one of the things that really feeds into that is the fact that very often job descriptions are written with a certain kind of candidate in mind. And that candidate will have a computer science degree and a personal and academic background dedicated solely to tinkering with computers. And that certainly wasn't me. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself now. I wanted to first talk a little bit more about this diversity problem in and of itself. So when I say it's bad, I mean just how bad is it? Well, if we start with women, in order to really form an opinion, first we need the answer to a question. And that question is, what kind of percentage of the UK tech industry currently is made up of women? And as it turns out, it's a bit trickier than you'd think to find a definitive answer to that question. When I first Googled it, when I first put this talk together for the first version a couple of years ago, Google told me it was 26%. But then when I tried to find out where that came from, I couldn't easily find a study behind that or know which professions within STEM it even encompassed. So I dug a little harder and I found a very similar figure of 27%. This is from an all-party parliamentary group on diversity and inclusion in STEM fields. They did a report in November 2020, and they've based it on the ONS workforce data up until the end of 2019. Now, in terms of their definition of STEM, they've included everyone from the original STEM fields, plus anyone in healthcare and related fields, as well as anyone who was a STEM educator. Now, the small doubt I would have by grouping all of those together is that very often the level of diversity differs from job to job, and the report itself pointed it out. Women are overrepresented in healthcare. We're 68% of that workforce. But if we narrowed it down to just engineers, because that's our field, we get 9%. So that's quite a big drop, and I think it shows it's really important not to just take that first figure you get from Google or that you see in an article and start to dig down into what it actually consists of. So 2020 was a few years back now, so I thought maybe I could look for something a bit more up to date. The APPG that did that report isn't active anymore as far as I can tell, but there's another organisation called Engineering UK that puts out a report every year. Their last one was in July. They use ONS data as well, and they put it at 15.7%. But before we celebrate too much that it's gone up, they said something about the ONS workforce data, which is a bit concerning, which is that the level of response to their surveys has gone down over the years. And I've started seeing this mentioned in other news articles about employment stats as well. I mean, it's a big problem. In order to get around this, they had to take each quarter and then form an average for that and then add them all together. So I'm sure they did their absolute best, but it does make you wonder, was the data there to allow them to come up with a very accurate report? But it's somewhere between maybe 9 and 16%. So how about ethnic minorities? It doesn't look much better there. The Google figure, as in first figure you get when you Google, is 25%. But again, that would encompass all of the STEM fields. It appears to come from the government's Department of Innovation and Tech. So the APPG report from 2020 puts it at 12%. So again, there's that massive drop. That's just engineers. And then again, when we go to the more modern one, it's gone up slightly, but 13.6%, so not by a lot. So before I comment on this anymore, I also wanted to say that women and ethnic minorities are only part of the picture. We also have huge inclusivity problems around LGBTQ+ people, people with disabilities, and anyone from a marginalised group, really. The data on those groups can be even harder to track down, and I've chosen in this talk to focus on women and ethnic minorities, but in future I would love to do a talk where I focus on the other groups as well, because I believe they all deserve to have their story told. So obviously these are not very encouraging statistics. They don't paint a picture of a very diverse industry. And it's such a big shame, because if you do go back to the early days of the computing industry, you'll find that a lot of the early pioneers weren't actually white men. And I have some examples to show you what I mean. So this is Ada Lovelace. She lived between 1815 and 1852 and is considered by many to be the world's first computer programmer. When she was 18, she met a gentleman called Charles Babbage, who was a mathematician and inventor. And he'd come up with a proposal for a machine called the analytical engine, which, unlike his other machine, the difference engine, hadn't actually been built and wasn't particularly well received in the UK. But an Italian author, Luigi Menabrea, had written an article about it, so she tasked herself with the job of translating it into English. Except she didn't just translate it. She improved it. She expanded upon it with her notes and her ideas. And in an effort to truly demonstrate how the machine would work, she came up with an appendix which contained an algorithm for calculating Bernoulli numbers. This is now considered to be the world's first computer program, written at a time before computers as we would even recognize them today existed. If we move forward a little bit to the era of World War II and the first half of the 20th century, some of you might have heard of Bletchley Park. It was a top-secret UK code-breaking centre, and the women pictured here were actually called human computers. It was their job to do complex math calculations in order to crack the Germans' Enigma code, and they were successful. Their efforts probably shortened the war by a number of years and likely saved countless lives. And it's around the same time in the US, machines were being developed to help towards the war effort, and the ENIAC machine was one of these. It was the world's first fully functional digital computer, and it was finished in 1945. It was programmed by 6 women, 4 of whom are in this photo. Now, each of the ENIAC 6 accomplished amazing things, but I wanted to highlight two in particular. Second in from the right is Betty Holberton, or Betty Snyder as she was known at the time, and on the far left over there is Jean Jennings-Bartik. On the 15th of February 1946, there was a grand unveiling of the ENIAC in front of military officials and scientists and the press at the University of Pennsylvania. And the purpose was to showcase the ENIAC's capabilities, particularly around artillery trajectories. Given that they'd just come out of a war, it kind of makes sense. So they were tasked with the job of preparing the ENIAC to do a ballistic trajectory calculation on the event for the demo. Now, in order to do this, they had to spend weeks in the run-up to that night wiring up all these plug boards on the machine and manually programming about 50,000 components. On the night, the machine was able to do the calculation in seconds, and this was a job that would have taken a human calculator hours or maybe even like days to complete. But despite their critical role in preparing the machine for the event, the women weren't introduced, acknowledged, or credited at all on the evening. And they weren't even invited to the celebration dinner, and their efforts weren't acknowledged for many decades to come. Grace Hopper was a computer scientist, a mathematician, and a United States Navy Rear Admiral. At the same time as ENIAC 6 were working in Pennsylvania, she was working in Harvard with Howard Aitken on a machine called the Automatic Sequence Controlled Calculator, which is more catchily known as the Mark I. So she was assigned to the Mark I by the Navy because she had a degree in mathematics, but also because she had studied difference equations. Now, Howard Aitken was undoubtedly a genius, having built this machine, but he wasn't very good at passing that knowledge on and hadn't written an instruction manual. Yeah. Grace not only figured out how to program this machine that was the size of a room, I mean, they were massive in those days, but she also crucially wrote that instruction manual. She truly believed in making this field more accessible for others, and she came up with shortcuts in order to improve and speed things up over time. So, as an example, she and the rest of the team on the Mark I, most of them women, kept notebooks where they noted down the steps needed to complete certain commonly used calculations. After a while, they began to collaborate and share their notebooks. These are essentially subroutines. And Grace was, in fact, the first person to devise the theory of machine-independent programming languages. And she later used this theory to come up with her own programming language, Flowmatic, which was the precursor to COBOL, the world's first high-level computer programming language. And it's hard to overstate what a big deal this was, because prior to this, every single individual machine had to have programs tailored to work on that hardware. Having a language that could work on any machine going forward was a game changer. And this is Dr. Clarence Skip Ellis. He was born in 1943 in the US at a time when racial segregation was something of a horrible reality he had to live with. When he was 15, he was employed by a company to look after and guard their computer, but he was on no account allowed to touch it. Despite that, though, it didn't stop him from reading all the manuals and teaching himself everything there was to know about it. One night, the machine malfunctioned, and he was the only one who knew how to fix it. As a result, he became their go-to computer problem solver. Eventually, his church funded him to attend university, and he went on to become the first black man in the US to get a PhD in computer science. He went on to work for several major tech companies. Most notably, between 1976 and 1984, he worked for the Palo Alto Research Institute, where he developed a program called Office Talk. This allowed people to collaborate remotely via Ethernet. This actually forms the basis of some of the collaboration tools we still use today, such as Google Docs. Now, the interesting thing about putting this talk together is I didn't have to dig very hard to find examples like this of people from different minorities making a huge contribution. There were many more. This is Margaret Hamilton. She was a software engineer for the Apollo 11 mission, and she stood here next to the code she wrote for the Apollo 11 flight software. And she's credited with coming up with the term software engineer in the first place. This is Mary Jackson. She was featured on Netflix's Hidden Figures, which I highly recommend if you have time to give it a watch. She was NASA's first black female engineer, but she had to really fight for it. She had to go to the city of Hampton and petition them to allow her to attend an all-white high school in order to qualify. And thankfully, they did let her, and she went on to take that role at NASA. And this is Evelyn Boyd Grenville. She was the first black woman in the US to get a PhD in mathematics. She worked for IBM, most notably on the IBM 650, which was the first computer intended for use in business. So, we have all of these amazing women and minorities in the early days of the tech industry, which leads us to the question of what happened? How did we go from this to, I don't know, maybe between 9 and 16% of engineers being women today, for example? Well, the answer is that as the 20th century progressed, it became very clear that computers were going to make people a lot of money. The first home PCs came out, and the status of the industry increased. Qualifications started to be required where perhaps they wouldn't have been required before. Women and other minorities began to be pushed out because this was no longer seen as a low-status job. And alongside this, people started to get an idea about what they thought a developer should look like. So this is where we end up with a nerdy developer stereotype. Now, I realise most of us here are developers today, and we know that the picture is normally very different from this, but unfortunately, a lot of people, maybe particularly people outside of the industry, will still think of someone like this when they think of someone who works with computers. So as well as being white and male and incredibly good at coding, the nerdy developer stereotype is known for being antisocial, awkward, and disinterested in people. And while not always intentional, these traits can be used to gatekeep the profession, particularly from women. I read of one account of a professor, a university professor, who insisted he wasn't sexist, but he hadn't seen the same level of passion in the women in his class as he saw in the men. And by passion, what he meant was they played computer games all day, did coding in their spare time, had no real social life outside of that. And while on the face of it, there's no real reason a woman can't do these things, in reality, we're far more likely to be responsible for childcare, elder care, school run, housework, even in 2025, unfortunately. And if we look at younger women who maybe don't have all of those responsibilities yet, well, we're usually socialized to be very different from this caricature. Whether it comes naturally to us or not, we're told we have to be caring and empathic and to believe friendship is important. So why would we want to buy into a profession where, on surface appearances at least, it looks like we're supposed to be something very different to what we've been told we have to be before? And this links back to what I was saying about that GCSE I took. I do think that this stereotype was in the heads, albeit subconsciously perhaps, of many of the girls in my year at school. They couldn't see themselves in this image, and so therefore they think the profession wasn't for them. They didn't want to do that GCSE. So, obviously it's a huge shame that our profession isn't more diverse, and wouldn't it be great if we could just wave a magic wand and make it all equal? But those statistics at the start certainly made me feel discouraged, and it doesn't feel like anything is going to change anytime soon. And after all, do things really have to change? I mean, we have all of these really genuinely talented developers, albeit most of them male and white. As long as the products are getting built, does it matter who is building them? Well, the issue with that is that when we are building and designing products, we are facing two main hurdles. One of them is that of unconscious bias, and the other, which is becoming a bigger and bigger problem in the age of AI, is the data gap. And I have some examples to illustrate why these matter. So first up, I wanted to play this video as a really good example of the effects of unconscious bias in action.
Futurism. Entering the future.
Nice. Okay, Noel, you try now. Come to your hand. Two black?
Two black.
Yeah.
So what I'll
Come
do...
again. Come again, Sashi.
No.
You two back over way.
What I have to do to get
what you have to do.
This is how racialist thing is.
Yeah.
I have to use that piece of white. Let's say a napkin and a shoulder again. What's the difference?
Bring your pin again.
Napkin again.
Right, put your hand now.
What's the color of my hand?
Man, the black man getting fight down all over, boy. All over.
I think we can turn that off now. So this, to me, is the perfect example of a perfect argument for why we need diverse products when we design, diverse teams when we design products. That video was uploaded a few years ago and it went viral. And I can absolutely guarantee you nobody in that team set out with the intention of producing a racist soap dispenser. But presumably, the whole team was white, and nobody thought to include someone with darker skin in the test group before they shipped the product. That's unconscious bias. I'll see if I can skip past this now to the next one. Yeah. Okay, another example. So I was very surprised to find that emoji is considered to be the world's fastest growing language, both in terms of its uptake and adoption. Its closest historical equivalent is hieroglyphics, and it's already far surpassed that in terms of its scope. And interestingly, women have traditionally been its heaviest users. A study by Adweek found that 78% of women use emoji, compared to 60% of men. But up until 2016, the vast majority of the emoji code base was male, or male images, or I'd go further and say male and white images. Now, by way of a summary of how emoji is made, they're decided on by the Unicode Consortium, which is a collection of organizations based in Silicon Valley. They come up with universal international software standards. So when they've decided on a new emoji they want to add to the arsenal, they will pass that request over to the platforms such as Google or Meta, and then it's up to them to interpret that request how they will. Now, to give the Unicode Consortium some credit, they used to stick to gender and ethnicity neutral language, but the issue was with the unconscious bias in the individual teams in the platforms, and this isn't a problem that's confined to just tech. Due to the environments we were brought up in, the textbooks we're given in school, and the way certain professions are portrayed in our media, we often default to male, for example, when we're presented with a gender-neutral term such as firefighter or scientist. And by the time, this starts at the age of 7 or 8 or so, and by the time we're adults and working in our jobs, we don't even think about it anymore. So in terms of emoji, the Unicode Consortium would tell the platforms to design a runner, and they would overwhelmingly design a male white runner because that's what popped into their heads the most naturally. So from 2015, the Unicode Consortium decided to take action by moving away from their use of gender and ethnicity neutral language. So from 2016, we end up with a much more diverse emoji code base. Now, what this goes to show is that unfortunately, even with the best of intentions, gender and ethnicity neutral language doesn't always work because we're fighting the unconscious bias that's baked into our society. The Unicode Consortium found this out the hard way and had to take direct and specific action to fix the problem. Another example I wanted to move on to, because there are loads of examples of products, unfortunately, that haven't been designed with women and other minorities in mind. But I wanted to talk about another technology which is becoming more and more problematic, potentially. And I'm, of course, talking about AI. It's here, it's big, we're all using it. And without a doubt, it's the most exciting technological breakthrough in recent years. But it's subject to that same unconscious bias that led us to our racist soap dispenser. And the reason is, as you're probably all aware, the way the LLMs work is they're fed large amounts of data, and then they use that data to spot patterns and draw conclusions. The issue is that the data that they're being fed, known as corpora, is very often biased towards white men, with the result that the LLMs can come out with solutions which could potentially disadvantage anyone who isn't a white man. So I have some examples of how this is playing out from the media. So this is one just from last week. A French regulator has investigated Meta's job advertising algorithm and found it to be sexist. It found that the algorithm would show jobs jobs like mechanic or pilot primarily to men, and jobs such as primary school teacher or psychologist primarily to women. And while this isn't any sort of legal ruling or recommendation, it is the first time a European regulator has found a social media's platform's algorithms to be discriminatory by gender. Meta, for its part, has responded to say they disagree with the findings and they're assessing their options. So we'll see what happens there. As you're probably aware as well, AI is increasingly being used for facial recognition technology, but studies have suggested facial recognition technology can also be biased. The data sets that were commonly used for older facial recognition technology, at least, were 83% white faces. Now, if there are fewer examples of non-white faces in the training data, then the algorithm is going to potentially struggle to tell two non-white people apart. And the studies have borne this out. The error rate for light-skinned men is 0.8%, compared to 34.7% for darker-skinned women. That's according to a study published in 2018 by MIT Media Lab. There was another one done in 2019 where it was concluded that facial recognition technology works best if you're a middle-aged man, less well if you are a woman, a younger person, an older person, or someone from an ethnic minority. And despite this, though, this technology is being rolled out and being used increasingly by police and by businesses that work in public places, such as high street shops. And the implications for law enforcement can be quite stark because black people are already more likely to be stopped, searched, and arrested by the police. And I meant to mention as well, sorry, the Met Police actually did get a study commissioned this year, which indicated that the algorithm they're using doesn't show any indication of bias. And I did get a bit excited and think maybe I could remove this bit from my talk. But basically another expert came out and found that the sample size was too small to really be confident about that. And we are still seeing the stories come out in the press, such as this one, where facial recognition technology mistook this person for a person on the wanted list, with the result that he was stopped by the police. And in this one, a woman was misidentified as a known shoplifter by the facial recognition software at the entrance to Home Bargains. The final example I wanted to feature was that of women's healthcare. So companies are increasingly turning to AI to help them achieve better healthcare outcomes, but the data sets they're using are still unfortunately heavily skewed towards men. And the reason for that is historically, the male body has been seen as the default human. This is an attitude that dates all the way back to the ancient Greeks when Aristotle described the female body as a mutilated male. And while we wouldn't use that term now, unfortunately the attitude that the male body is simply a variation, the female body is a variation of the male body has persisted into modern medicine. Medical students will learn about anatomy and female anatomy, we're like a little afterthought. Or they will use textbooks and the images to illustrate will be made primarily of men. And when it comes to healthcare trials, up until as recently as the 1990s, women of childbearing age were more often than not deliberately excluded from trial groups. The reason being presumably that a woman might get pregnant during the course of a trial, even if she wasn't intending to, or that she would have inconvenient hormone fluctuations over the course of a month. That kind of sounds logical until you take into account the fact that women are then expected to use the drugs that come out of these trials, despite the fact they've not been tested on bodies like theirs. So this has led to a bit of a deficit of data when it comes to women's health, and studies that are done more than 30 years old often don't give a breakdown of the results by sex, even when they have included women. So how is an AI going to stand a chance of not extrapolating data from men to women? So I have a few examples, again, out of the media. This one, they were using AI in a research study into liver disease, and they found that it missed 44% of the cases in the female subjects, as opposed to 23% in the men. And that's quite scary. It's like almost twice as likely to miss the disease in you if you're a woman. And this is one from this year, which is a finding that AI will take the case notes, this is social case notes of a female subject, and downplay her healthcare needs compared to a male subject with the same health conditions. The author of the study, I've put his quote up here because I think it just sums it up. If social workers are actually relying on those AI-generated summaries, then they're going to make decisions based on gender rather than actual need. And I find that quite sad because when you think about the people that are actually in the social care system, they tend to be older people, they might have cognitive issues, they're going to be less able to advocate for themselves than someone who perhaps doesn't have those issues. So obviously I realise this all sounds very depressing, but I genuinely do believe that there is some hope in here. If we can involve more diverse team members when we're building, designing and testing our products, then we have a chance of actually intervening in some of these issues that we encounter and perhaps trying to sort of solve, well, at least work against some of the problems caused by the bias endemic in our society as well as the bias in our data. And to prove that things might be getting a bit better even in AI land, I have this article which I just wanted to share, which is quite recent as well. AI has moved from a point where it was erasing people's disabilities during image generation, even when it was asked not to a point now where it just isn't. And there's a wonderful quote that sums up everything I've said by the CEO of a company called Create Labs, which I'll leave you with, which is, diversity in AI starts with who's involved in training and labeling the data. It's about who's in the room when the data is being built. You need cultural representation at the creation stage. If you don't consult the people with lived experiences, then AI will miss them. Thank you.